Celaena rushed to Elias, who moaned as she turned him over. The wound in his stomach was still bleeding. She ripped strips from her tunic, which was already soaked with blood, and shouted for help as she bound him tightly. There was a scrape of cloth on stone, and Celaena looked over her shoulder to see the master trying to drag himself across the stones to his son. The paralytic must be wearing off. 5 bloodied assassins came rushing up the stairs, eyes wide and faces pale as they beheld Mikhail and Elias. Celaena left Elias in their care as she dashed to the master.
"Don't move,"
she told him, wincing as blood from her face dripped onto his white clothes.
"You might hurt yourself."
She scanned the podium for any sign of the poison and rushed to the fallen bronze goblet. A few sniffs revealed that the wine had been laced with a small amount of Gloriella. Just enough to paralyze him, not kill him. Ansel must have wanted him completely prone before she killed him. She must have wanted him to know she was the one who had betrayed him. To have him conscious while she severed his head. How had he not noticed it before he drank? Perhaps he wasn't as humble as he seemed. Perhaps he had been arrogant enough to believe that he was safe here.
"It'll wear off,"
she told the master. But she still called for the antidote to speed up the process. One of the assassins took off at a run. She sat by the master, one hand clutching her bleeding neck. The assassins at the other end of the room carried out Elias, stopping only to reassure the master that his son would be fine. Celaena nearly groaned with relief at that, but straightened as a dry, calloused hand wrapped around hers, squeezing faintly. She looked down to the face of the master, whose eyes shifted to the open door. He was reminding her of the promise she'd made. Ansel had been given 20 minutes to clear firing range. It was time. Ansel was already a dark blur in the distance, hissily galloping as if demons were biting at her hooves. She was heading northwest over the dunes, towards the Singing Sands, to the narrow bridge of the feral jungle that separated the desert lands from the rest of the continent. And then the open expanse of the western wastes beyond them, towards Briarcliff. Atop the battlements, Celaena drew an arrow from her quiver and knocked it into her bow. The bowstring moaned as she pulled it back, further and further, her arms straining. Focusing upon the tiny figure atop the dark horse, Celaena took aim. In the silence of the fortress, the bowstring twanged like a mournful harp. The arrow soared, turning relentlessly. The red dunes passed beneath it in a blur, closing the distance. A slither of winged darkness, edged with steel. A quick, bloody death. Hisley's tail flicked to the side as the arrow buried itself in the sand, just inches behind her rear hooves. But Ansel didn't dare look over her shoulder. She kept riding, and she didn't stop. Celaena lowered her bow and watched until Ansel disappeared beyond the horizon. One arrow, that had been her promise. But she'd also promised Ansel that she had 20 minutes to get out of range. Celaena had fired after 21. The master called Celaena to his chamber the following morning. It had been a long night, but Elias was on the mend, the wound having narrowly missed puncturing any organs. All of Lord Beric's soldiers were dead, and were in the process of being carted back to Xandria as a reminder to Beric to seek the King of Ireland's approval elsewhere. 20 assassins had died, and a heavy mourning silence filled the fortress. Celaena sat on an ornately carved wooden chair, watching the master as he stared out the window at the sky. She nearly fell out of her seat when he began speaking.
I am glad you did not kill Ansel.
His voice was raw, and his accent thick, with the clipped yet rolling sound of some language she'd never heard before.
I have been wondering when she would decide what to do with her fate.
So you knew?
The master turned from the window.
I have known for years. Several months after Ansel's arrival, I sent inquiries to the Flatlands. Her family had not written her any letters, and I was worried that something might have happened.
He took a seat in a chair across from Celaena.
My messenger returned to me some months later, saying there was no Briarcliff. The Lord and his eldest daughter had been murdered by the High King. And the youngest daughter, Ansel, was missing.
Why didn't you ever confront her?
Celaena touched the narrow scab on her left cheek. It wouldn't scar if she looked after it properly. And if it did scar, then maybe she'd hunt down Ansel and return the favour.
Because I hoped she would eventually trust me enough to tell me. I had to give her that chance, even if it was a risk. I hoped she would learn to face her pain, that she'd endure it. If you can learn to endure pain, you can survive anything. Some people learn to embrace it, to love it. Some endure it through drowning it in sorrow or making themselves forget. Others turn it to anger. But Ansel let her pain become hate and let it consume her until she became something else entirely. A person I don't think she ever wanted to be.
Celaena absorbed his words, but set them aside for consideration at a later time.
Are you going to tell everyone about what she did?
No, I would spare them that anger. Many believed Ansel was a friend, and part of me too believes at times she was.
Celaena looked at the floor, wondering what to do with the ache in her chest. Would turning it into rage, as he said, help her endure it?
For what it is worth, Celaena,
He rasped.
I believe you are the closest thing to a friend Ansel has ever allowed herself to have. And I think she sent you away because she truly cared for you.
She hated her mouth for wobbling.
It doesn't make it hurt any less.
I didn't think it would. But I think you will leave a lasting imprint on Ansel's heart. You spared her life and returned her father's sword. She will not soon forget that. And maybe when she makes her next move to reclaim her title, she will remember the assassin from the north and the kindness you showed her, and try to leave your bodies in her wake.
He walked to the latticework hutch, as if he were giving her time to regain her composure, and pulled out a letter. By the time he returned to her, Celaena's eyes were clear.
When you give this to your master, hold your head high.
She took the letter, her recommendation. It seemed inconsequential in the face of everything that had just happened.
How is it that you're speaking to me now? I thought your vow of silence was eternal.
He shrugged.
The world does seem to think so. But as far as my memory serves me, I've never officially sworn to be silent. I choose to be silent most of the time, and I've become so used to it that I often forget I have the capacity for speech. But there are some times when words are necessary, when explanations are needed, that mere gestures cannot convey.
She nodded, trying her best to hide her surprise. After a pause, the master said,
If you ever want to leave the north, you will always have a home here. I promise you, the winter months are far better than the summer. And I think my son would be rather happy if you decided to return to...
He chuckled, and Celaena blushed. He took her hand.
When you leave tomorrow, you will be accompanied by a few of my people.
Why?
Because they will be needed to drive the wagon to Zandria. I know that you are indentured to your master, that you still owe him a good deal of money before you are free to live your own life. He is making you pay back a fortune that he forced you to borrow.
He squeezed her hand before approaching one of the 3 trunks pushed against the wall.
For saving my life and sparing hers.
He flipped open the lid of a trunk, then another, and another. Sunlight gleamed on the gold inside, reflecting through the room like light on water. All that gold, and the piece of spider silk the merchant had given her. She couldn't think of the possibilities that wealth would open to her. Not right now.
When you give your master his letter, also give him this. And tell him that in the Red Desert we do not abuse our disciples.
Celaena smiled slowly.
I think I can manage that.
She looked to the open window, to the world beyond. For the first time in a long while, she heard the song of the northern winds, calling her home. And she was not afraid.